Darwin also made predictions. He claimed, for instance, that there must be a great number of so-called transitional species among fossils which would demonstrate a line of hereditary descent.
One of the basic problems of the theory of evolution is the transition from aquatic life to land vertebrates. How can amphibians evolve from fish? Many fossils have been found dating from the period in which it's assumed that this evolution took place. And naturally, attempts have been made to find links to aquatic life with these fossils. The sequence is as follows. On the one hand, fossils have been found which belong to the crossopterygians, that is to fish, and all the fossils discovered are clearly fish, some perhaps strange and exotic, and unlike any fish living today, but still clearly fish. And then on the other hand, there's another group of fossils, which could equally clearly be characterized as amphibian. They have the typical structure of a four-legged creature, 4 limbs with specific bone and finger structures. All fossils found there are clearly amphibian, even if they're unusual and not like present-day animals. To this day, not a single example of the transition from fish to amphibian has been found in any geological stratum.
Die hat man bis zum heutigen Tag nicht gefunden in den geologischen Schichten.
For a long time it was believed that the crossopterygian was our predecessor. 64 million years ago, according to the theory of evolution, the majority of these creatures fell victim to changes in climate, salt content and shrinking of the ocean. An embarrassing surprise for Darwinists came when it was discovered that the crossopterygian, believed to be extinct for 64 million years, in fact still lives. There are many other examples of living fossils. Many fossils have been found that are identical to plants living today, such as ferns and the poplar, plane and ginkgo trees. The question perseveres. How have plants and animals survived unchanged over such long periods of time? According to Darwin, there are only 2 paths in the struggle for survival: natural selection and change, or extinction. Today it's apparent that extreme adaptability and specialization considered by Darwin to be advantageous is not without its disadvantages. When the ability to adjust to new, unexpected environmental changes diminishes, the danger of extinction increases. In contrast, living fossils like sharks were spared this fate. For whatever reasons, they seem to have been able to avoid over-specialization. Simultaneously, and this doesn't fit with Darwin's concept, living fossils are evidence that supports the constancy of form over an extended time period.
The missing links which would connect the large groups of living creatures were a crucial question for Darwin, and they remain so to this very day. Only an astoundingly small number of fossils, which could be classified as a transition phase between the large groups of creatures, has been found. This has led some geologists and paleontologists to look for models of evolution that wouldn't require missing links. What can be said generally is that no indisputable missing links have yet been found. Various specimens have been found, but their significance is contested in the field of science.
If Darwin saw the paucity of the fossil links as a threat to his theory, his student Haeckel explained it thus.
Paleontologic traditions are fundamentally incomplete and should not have a decisive effect on the construction of phylogenetic trees.
Haeckel was the first to draw up detailed phylogenetic trees depicting the phylogeny of organisms. In General Morphology of Organisms, published in 1866, he included the first phylogenetic tree, but also reconstructed the line of man's descent from the lower animals.
Ernst Haeckel was an excellent illustrator. The entrance gate to the World's Fair in Paris exhibited his nature studies, and his book, Art Forms in Nature, is still much admired today, even if he didn't do the final drawings himself. Haeckel's artistic talent proved to be a temptation to him to promote his scientific objectives. Wherever Darwin's evolution theory lacked concrete proof, Haeckel the artist went to work.
Grundsätzlich sind Stammbaumzeichnungen Modelle.
Phylogenetic trees are basically models produced on the very presupposition of evolution theory.
Anfang an eine evolutionstheoretische Voraussetzung.
Illustrations of phylogenetic trees should never be confused with reality or the truth of evolutionary biology. They're models that can be drawn one way or another and are therefore open to many different interpretations.
That's exactly what happened in the case of Archaeopteryx. In previous decades, Archaeopteryx was proclaimed the missing link between reptiles and birds for 5 different groups of reptiles, until it was finally determined to be not an early form of bird. Around 1900, an inconspicuous booklet with a harmless title, Experiments with Plant Hybrids, lay like a time bomb in over 120 university libraries throughout Europe. Its author was Johann Gregor Mendel.
Eines der erstaunlichsten Phänomene.
In the early 20th century, one of the most astounding phenomena was the reaction of many biologists, zoologists and botanists around the world to the so-called rediscovery of Mendel's laws.
Überall regte sich Opposition.
The opposition everywhere vehemently disparaged this rediscovery. In England, for example, the School of Biometry was a strict proponent of Darwinism and strongly opposed William Bateson, a zoologist. It was Bateson, you see, who more or less rediscovered Mendel's laws and championed them in England. He was intensely attacked.
Wurde auf das heftigste angegriffen.
An English researcher named Hirst suffered similar denigration as one of the first to confirm the 3-to-1 ratio of Mendel's law after the turn of the century. He initially observed this law in attempts to crossbreed orchids, and subsequent research into the genealogy of racehorses confirmed it. Hirst's findings were presented to the Royal Society, where he came up against Professor Walter F.R. Weldon, chairman of the Zoological Committee and a confirmed Darwinist.
Der Zoologe
Weldon bitterly refused to accept the evidence. He tried everything to prevent publication of Hirst's findings, and then exhausted himself, to the detriment of his health, in an effort to refute Mendel's laws.
Weldon did succeed in preventing Hirst's argument from being heard at a Royal Society meeting on December the 7th, 1905. But Weldon still wasn't satisfied. He laboured over the documents day and night in the hope of discrediting his opponent. Carl Pearson, a friend of Weldon's and a Darwinist himself, wrote to Hirst.
Only a few days before his death, Weldon condemned in stronger language than I have ever heard him use of any individual the tone and contents of the note added to your paper. It is a judgment in which I believe every man who has the interests of science at heart will concur.
The opposition went so far that in 1903, the leading natural science journal, Nature, rejected all essays pertaining to Mendel for a certain time. In other words, it boycotted an entire branch of science in the name of Darwinist ideology. That branch of science was, of course, genetic research, the newly flourishing Mendelism.
The First World War far surpassed all previous wars in terms of scale and horror. It also made use of a new weapon, poison gas. Among the soldiers wounded by gas on the Western Front was an Austrian fighting with a Bavarian regiment. His name was Adolf Hitler. Like many of his contemporaries, Hitler was impressed with Darwin's theory of evolution and the merciless fight for survival. A few years after the war, he published his political manifesto, Mein Kampf.
The stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. Only the born weakling can view this as cruel. But he, after all, is only a weak and limited man. Because if this law did not prevail, any conceivable higher development of organic living beings would be unthinkable.